So we're here to solve the star battle puzzle by Jonas Gleim. Its theme is divided, and the centermost region that splits the lower left to upper right seems to be the key part of that. There are 5 other regions on the upper left and 4 on the lower right, and that does seem to suggest the upper left will be more compact and easier place to start. These 7-cell shapes that are like this are sort of interesting. There's nothing right around them that lets us eliminate all the cells, but for instance, if I set in any of these corners around the grid, I effectively give just one. I will always force one sure star, and in some cases, like this, force both sure stars. And so there's a fair amount of constraint around those spaces. That doesn't look to be enough to get started, but it suggests even another thing. Let's take this sort of region. And let's get to where we see, for instance, one of the stars in the space is probably in these 3 cells. But a thing to note is that if we need to have at least one of these 4 cells I just marked in black contain a star, a cell like this, which sees all of those, is going to be problematic. And so actually, I think one of the ways to start on this puzzle is to actually mark both of these 2 cells as unusable, get that there's a star up here up in the top, that there's also a star here, and start to work out from there. One thing that happens as you mark cells like this is you see that there are regions that are fairly limited in the rows they can take, and the thing that interests me most is actually this top space. I have effectively already marked now in blue where 3 stars in the whole grid will go, and those are the stars for the top 2 rows. And if I come over to this region in red, I have to take 1 star down here, and that leaves behind enough space for 1 more star up here in blue. And now all 4 stars are marked in blue, and I get a pattern like this to start the grid. And I can mark a few more things. I can mark a star here. I can mark this cell as unusable because this star has to be within the region that's to the top of it, so I can't use this space. So stars are here and here. These cells aren't usable. This cell isn't usable. There's actually looks like pretty much a cluster where these 2 by 2 squares are going. And in saying that, my eye is drawn actually over to here. We've marked off a 2 by 2 part of a 10-cell grid as unusable. And that means there are now exactly 4 2 by 2 squares where stars could go. So a star has to go in this space, in this space, in this space, and in this space. And I'll clean that up and recolor it again, but there's a way to recognize that you've got to place 4 stars in any of these spots, that the limitations of how that goes will effectively mean that you have a star in the centers of these points. And we already have some of that notation on the right. I won't sort of fully mark, but we've got for sure these stars and then 1 more that's in these last 3 cells that we'll push out. But here's a corollary to that. Where I was looking at these rows about it, the same thing is true in these rightmost columns, that the 4 stars have to be in these 4 2 by 2 cells I just marked. And very much what looks like it's going to play out in the grid. There's actually not too much value right away from just seeing that those are the 4 spaces, but I now have a set of cells here that are functionally the same as this upper right orange box that for sure do not have stars because I've got the 4 stars in these 2 rows. And that's going to give me the requirements that the 4 stars in the 7th and 8th columns are in these spaces, and that's going to come back and give me these cells are now where the stars don't go. And so look at this. We're going to keep getting this pattern. This is a very interesting shape that's coming out through the divided region to get all these cancellations. And it looks like the whole diagonal is going to tile like this and be a constraint of this. So we've got a lot of the grid now marked as unusable. There's not, where there's still like 4 options of how to use this divided grid for where stars go. There's a little bit to still think through to get into the solve of the puzzle, but for sure, I think this was part of the intended path to eventually find was how the grid splits out into the 20 placements of stars in a pattern that's very much like this shape and has the constellation across it. And that's looks like it's probably a practical constraint of having 10 stars in this upper left diagonal. They have to be split out. I think that's probably the case, that they have to be split out. The only way to get 10 stars in a shape like this is to mark in that pattern diagonal perfectly with this and this. So at the start we could have seen that. That's probably a meta constraint that would start the whole puzzle before any rows, regions or rows were split apart. So really interesting seed for the grid. We still want to actually place a full star for sure. And one thing that I do when I've got a whole lot of almost placements is start to look at a few spots that might be limiting. And in particular, in some of these spaces, some of these cells in red are interesting. And why are they interesting? Well, the star here forces a star because it eliminates 2 of the 3 options to go in the adjoining space, which quickly sort of forces other things. And so these quick forcings are pretty limiting. And the quick forcing that looks a lot more promising to me is actually this one from the top red cells, that if I put this in, again, I eliminate those cells, that puts in the star, and now I actually sweep across, and I clear almost all of the second row and leave just a space for 1 star. So that's no good. So this cell is not part of a star. That's going to mean that the star is here, which means these are not part of that shape. The star is here. That's going to push the clues out to the left and mark these as not where stars go. And so that gives a star in these spots, and they're going to start pushing out. This cell now pushes to here, clears out these. There are 2 cells that actually are left in this row that are 2 apart. We couldn't place a star here, but we can place a star in these 2 cells. That cancels these, place a star here, cancels this cell, places a star there. We actually have placed all the stars in the 6 columns, so these clues come over, and this clue comes over. And how are we going to do the next placements? We still have 4 options in this center divide, so there's too much there. It seems pretty good that we've got 1 star for sure in this bottommost region marked in the space, and actually you'll see in this lowest row, the only region with cells is this bottom region here. So all the other cells out of that bottom row aren't usable. So these cells weren't usable, and that forces the 2 stars I just marked. We've got where this row is finished, this row is finished. Maybe that will help us a bit. We'll move our clues up and just see if that cleans anything out for us. We have to get a star in here, and that means one of these places is going to be unusable and force another star down below it, whether this one or this one. And I think what that means is this cell is not usable and the star is right above. And now that we've got an either or here, this group has to have a star. It's going to have 1 in the space, and the second one will be here. So this region up top needs to have 2 stars in it, so it has to take this one. We actually have also marked, I guess I missed this, I've marked 2 in the center divide. So the center divide is actually finished here, and that will give us quick progress. We have finished these columns as well. We've got 2 stars to mark in the space. I'm going to force this one up and that one there, and we finished this tricky puzzle. Had a lot of different geometry that popped up through the solve, and I think as you caught on to the center region and how these 2x2 unusable squares pop out, placed a lot of constraints in the grid, and then I was just careful note tracking and examples like finding these cells that push against each other and would force contradictions quickly to get through to the end of the grid. So really enjoyed the submission, Jonas. Hope you got some learnings from this video, and we'll see you again soon.